This is a review of the 1975 Arthur Hiller film The Man in the Glass Booth, starring Maximilian Schell. I previously reviewed the film The Hospital, which was also directed by Arthur Hiller, on this channel. Of course, his most famous film was Love Story, which is quite a bit different to this movie. This film is an adaptation of a play, and it was a production of something called American Film Theater. This was a production company in the early 1970s that made film adaptations of famous plays with a couple of catches. These films were distributed to certain theaters. There were around 500 theaters that were part of this American Film Theater thing. That's fairly straightforward so far, but one of the catches was that they would only show each movie 4 times. Each theater would only screen each movie 4 times. And keep in mind that in the 70s, home video was not really a thing yet. The VHS tape would be invented in the mid-70s, perhaps not popularized until the 80s. And so seeing a film in theaters had a different connotation. Once it was gone, it was not so easy to find it out on the internet or even in a video store, which wouldn't really have been a thing at the time. American Film Theater was something that you could subscribe to, a bit like you would for sort of a normal theater. There, you would subscribe for a season, which would be a set of plays, and then you would go to the movie theater and watch these movies one of the 4 nights that they were there. So it's a very interesting hybrid, and I'd be interested in looking into this more deeply and trying to understand exactly which elements of the film they wanted and which elements of the play they wanted and what their goal really was. Clearly they had some thought on the exclusivity of the performance or something like that, it not being around forever, it being only available for a limited amount of time. That's kind of a theatrical trait. But these are not stodgy adaptations. These are not filmed versions of plays. Now, even some theaters, I don't know, maybe the pandemic changed this a bit, but previously, at least, there were some theaters that would show, like they would have partnerships with Broadway plays and such to show sometimes even like live versions of a play in the theater. And these largely would be filmed to seem more like plays because you're going to watch a play in a movie theater. American Film Theater wasn't really into this. This film is a good adaptation. The scenery is somewhat sparse, although one of the locations in this movie is phenomenal. It's a New York City penthouse apartment near the Plaza Hotel, near the Apple Store on Fifth Avenue. An apartment that is rather grotesquely appointed, part shrine and part museum, perhaps a reflection of its occupant's mind. There's no fluff in this, so there's nothing added just to make it into a movie. There's no car chase that they stick in the middle of it. It seems like a faithful adaptation of the play and, you know, a reasonably cinematic adaptation as well. The acting is a bit dramatic. Maybe an element of classical Hollywood, maybe an element of the theatrical there. This movie kind of needs a virtuosic lead performance, and it definitely sets the stage for a virtuosic lead performance. Maximilian Schell is a great actor. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Judgment at Nuremberg. Phenomenal performance in a great movie. He was born in Austria, moved to Switzerland at a young age. A lot of people think that Maximilian Schell is German. At least some people might be tempted to think that, but it ain't true. When you watch the whole movie, I think you'll really appreciate Maximilian Schell in this film. I think you'll think he's great. But it is maybe a bit tough to latch onto it. Maybe a little bit over the top in the beginning. And maybe that's because the character that he's playing is over the top. He plays this eccentric Jewish industrialist, sort of pseudo-intellectual named Arthur Goldman. Eccentric is putting it lightly. This paranoid industrialist, Arthur Goldman, bearing, to some extent, the scars of the Holocaust, which is a major theme of this film. Like I said, this is it's an over-the-top role, and it's possible that he could have started things out with a little bit more subtlety. But overall, I think you'll be impressed by Maximilian Schell in this movie. Anyway, the American Film Theater is kind of an interesting little historical tidbit. Unfortunately, the movies weren't really distributed very widely at the time in the 70s, and they also weren't released on home video very widely or made available in any other form. They weren't really on television or anything like that. You can get them on DVD now, and I think actually this movie you can now watch for free on YouTube. I think somebody uploaded it. Might not be around anymore, but at least when I watched it a couple days ago, there was also a version available on YouTube, so you can go check that out. But like I said, not particularly widely circulated, which is why this film only has 1,200 votes on IMDb, which is a bit lower than you would expect. Arthur Hiller, relatively famous director, Maximilian Schell, beloved actor, and this is a pretty good movie. I don't really want to say much about what happens in this movie. This is probably going to be a short video because I really don't want to tell you much about the plot. I think this movie is best experienced with few, if any, expectations. Let me give you a couple of warnings. First of all, this movie has fairly unlikable characters. I've already hinted at this Arthur Goldman character being a little bit paranoid, being a little bit hard to latch onto. Don't expect necessarily empathetic moments throughout this film. There may be some, perhaps at unexpected times. But like I said, this film had somewhat unlikable characters. Of course, there's tons of great movies that have unlikable characters. I don't think it breaks the movie, but it's something to just prepare yourself for a little bit when you go in to watch this. You should have some patience with this movie. Often, I find when you watch movies that are adapted from plays, it's good to wait for the third act. This movie is no different. That's kind of kludgy advice in some ways. Obviously, there's tons of different adaptations. There's tons of different things out there. But often, like I said, it can be good to wait for the third act. Sometimes plays are set up a little bit differently to have more gradual build-up, bigger payoff or something like that. Like I said, big generalization here, but it applies in this case. One thematic thing I do want to mention is that there is a literal glass booth at one point in this film, but there is also a figurative glass booth throughout the movie, perhaps. A cage, some sort of confinement, some sort of surveillance, some sort of guilt, some kind of deception, insanity. These are things that all come to play in this movie, and as you watch it, think about what kind of glass booth characters might be trapped inside of from the beginning, and perhaps this echoes maybe even some of the architectural traits of this beautiful penthouse apartment. The final thing to mention is brief comparison with Judgment at Nuremberg. Like I said, Maximilian Schell won the Best Actor Academy Award for that, beating out Spencer Tracy. In my opinion, Judgment at Nuremberg, I think, might be the strongest cast in any movie I've ever seen. It's an incredibly good movie that I can't recommend enough. Came out in the very early 60s in an era when there were a number of serious social drama films that were still using some classical traits, many classical Hollywood traits, but were also a bit more serious and had just the beginnings of some modern cinema throughout. Judgment at Nuremberg is one of these movies, and it's a fantastic movie that presents extremely complex issues in a somewhat simple but, well, I would say in a somewhat accessible but still very complex manner. And like I said, I think it has probably the greatest cast I've ever seen. Incredible movie. Much better than this movie. But the thing I wanted to actually mention is that there is a little bit of overlap. There are some stylistic traits, for instance. One of the hallmarks of Judgment at Nuremberg, one thing it uses a lot, probably overuses this, actually, is these like quick zooms where the camera will really zoom in on a person or on a sign on a building or something like that. And we see that a couple times in this movie too. There's a couple of other things I don't want to get into about the way that the plot is structured. One of the ways that Judgment at Nuremberg shifts gears a little bit is also done in this movie. One of the ways that it kind of signals the changing of the act or something like that, or that it shifts into something a bit more serious. There's a similar tactic here. Overall, this movie is pretty good. I think it's worth giving it a chance. When I say giving it a chance, I mean watching the whole thing and thinking about it a little bit. And it might take some time to some extent, but this is a movie that overall makes a big impression. At first, it seemed like a little bit of a wild movie, believe me, but overall, it makes quite an impression. And I think it gives you a lot to think about. So in general, I think this movie has both kind of interesting oddity quality in this American film theater thing, in a somewhat not very well-known Maximilian Schell movie, and in his somewhat over-the-top character, and sort of the location, sort of some of the antics beginning the film. Certainly, it seems somewhat novel in the beginning, but I think this is actually legitimately a pretty darn good movie as well. So I would generally recommend The Man in the Glass Booth from 1975.